The blueprints were signed. The steel was ordered. The bank's $52 million expansion project was supposed to be the jewel of the city's skyline, a gleaming monument to corporate dominance. But deep in the bowels of the archives, a clerk made a single, catastrophic mistake. They threw away a rusted, water-stained piece of paper that looked like trash. It was an old property deed, forgotten by time and ignored by the board of directors. Within 48 hours of that paper hitting the incinerator, the entire construction site, millions of dollars in equipment, structural steel, and prestige, collapsed into a chaotic, legal nightmare. How did one scrap of paper bring down a financial empire? Let's find out. The city of Oakhaven wasn't just growing, it was exploding. At the center of this metamorphosis was the First National Prosperity Bank. They weren't just a financial institution, they were the architects of the local economy. Their CEO, Marcus Thorne, was a man who measured his success in square footage and vertical reach. The Horizon Project, a $52 million expansion, was his magnum opus. It was designed to consolidate every branch, every server, and every secret into one impenetrable fortress of glass and high-tensile steel. The location chosen was the Old West End district. It was historic, rugged, and seemingly abandoned by everyone except the ghosts of the industrial era. Thorne saw potential where others saw rot. He saw a gold mine. To the board, the acquisition of the land was a formality. They had the lawyers, the capital, and the political backing to flatten the history of the neighborhood and replace it with their sleek, modern vision. But there is a difference between owning the law and owning the land. The atmosphere in the boardroom was electric. "Gentlemen," Thorne had said, gesturing to the 3D model of the project, "by this time next year, we won't just be operating in this city, we will be holding the city's heartbeat in our hands." The construction teams were already mobilized. The groundbreaking ceremony had been scheduled for the following Monday. They had bulldozed the storefronts, cleared the debris, and stripped the land down to its raw, ancient earth. However, the legal team had a minor hurdle, the Deed of Antiquity. This was an obscure, centuries-old document that governed the specific zoning rights of the West End. Most people in the city didn't even know it existed. When the bank's internal auditing firm went through the archives to clear the title, they found a file that didn't match the digital records. It was yellowed, brittle, and smelled of damp earth. A junior clerk named Elias was tasked with digitizing the files. He was under immense pressure to clear the backlog before the quarterly audit. He looked at the deed, the official, original parchment, and compared it to the digital scan on his screen. Because of a slight clerical error in the digital entry, the address on the screen didn't perfectly align with the text on the paper. To Elias, it looked like a clerical relic, a redundant, useless copy of a record that had already been digitized. With a sigh of relief, he tossed the original into the document shredder. He thought he was helping the bank streamline its operations. He didn't know he was shredding the bank's future. The shredder hummed, the sound of 1,000 promises being turned into confetti. But the building didn't know the deed was gone. The workers arrived the next morning, ready to pour the foundation. They had no idea that by destroying that document, they had inadvertently invalidated their own zoning permits. Someone, however, was watching. Somewhere in the city. An individual, someone who had been waiting for the bank to make a move, realized that the legal barrier holding the bank back had just been incinerated, but not in the way the bank hoped. Take a look at the screen. Imagine if you bought a house, only to realize the person you bought it from never actually owned the land beneath it. Have you ever felt like you were standing on solid ground, only to have the floor fall out from under you? Comment below, have you ever been involved in a legal dispute that felt impossible to win? The morning the concrete trucks rolled onto the site, the air was thick with the smell of diesel and anticipation. Marcus Thorne stood on a makeshift platform, adjusting his silk tie, waiting for the cameras. He was ready to narrate the birth of an era. But as the first truck backed into position, the site foreman, a grizzled veteran named Miller, received a frantic call from the city's zoning and records office. It wasn't a standard clearance call. It was a cease and desist order that seemed to vibrate through the phone line. "What do you mean, lack of title continuity?" Miller barked, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his safety vest. The voice on the other end was cold, clinical, and utterly unbothered by the millions of dollars currently idling in the mud. The bank had assumed that once the physical dirt was cleared, their ownership was absolute. They had forgotten that in the world of high-stakes real estate, physical control is only half the battle. The other half is the paper trail, the invisible chains that bind land to its history. The secret lay in the specific clause that Elias had shredded. It wasn't just a deed, it was a reversionary interest. Centuries ago, when the West End was first settled, the land had been granted to the city by a private estate with one singular, ironclad condition: the land was to be used strictly for public heritage or community benefit. If the land were ever transferred to a private commercial entity for profit, ownership would immediately and automatically revert to the heirs of the original estate. Elias hadn't just shredded a piece of paper, he had destroyed the only legal proof that the bank was not the owner. By the time the bank's legal team realized the mistake, the deed was already a mountain of confetti in a waste processing facility. But the heirs, the descendants of that original estate, hadn't been idle. They were a quiet, unassuming family who had been waiting for decades, watching the bank's arrogance grow, waiting for a single, fatal slip-up. As the morning progressed, the construction site became a stage for a surreal drama. By 10 a.m., local law enforcement arrived. They didn't come to arrest the workers, they came to serve an eviction notice to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Thorne rushed from the platform, his face a mask of disbelief. "This is preposterous," he shouted at the officers. "We have the contracts. We have the permits." The lead officer simply handed him a document, a court-ordered injunction that had been filed and approved within hours of the shredding incident. The heirs had been monitoring the zoning filings for years. They knew exactly how the bank operated, and they had a team of attorneys who were faster, sharper, and far more patient than the bank's overpaid corporate counsel. The construction equipment sat silent. The workers huddled in groups, uncertain if they were even going to get paid for the day. Thorne looked up at the skeletal frame of the unfinished project. He didn't know that the heirs weren't just looking to reclaim the land, they were looking to dismantle the bank's public reputation. Someone had tipped them off. Someone inside the bank had been waiting for the moment to strike back. Who was the whistleblower, and why were they trying to bring Thorne down from the inside? Have you ever seen a situation where a massive giant was brought to their knees by the smallest possible detail? It's poetic justice, really. If you think the bank deserves this headache, hit that like button to help push this story to more people. CTA. While you watch this unfold, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We go deep into these corporate downfalls every single week, and you don't want to miss the final update on what happened to Marcus Thorne. The standoff at the construction site was only the beginning. Inside the glass-walled headquarters of First National Prosperity, the panic was palpable. Marcus Thorne had retreated to his corner office, but the power dynamic had shifted. His board of directors, usually a collection of yes-men and silent observers, were now whispering in the hallways. The bank stock price had already begun to slide, reacting to the rumors of a legal disaster. Every hour the site stood silent, the bank was losing tens of thousands of dollars in liquidated damages and contractor penalties. But the real threat wasn't the legal battle, it was the leak. Someone had provided the heirs with the exact timeline of the bank's zoning application, the specific department that held the original deed, and even the name of the clerk who had destroyed it. This wasn't just a win for the heirs, it was a targeted assassination of the bank's credibility. The internal investigation began, led by a ruthless head of corporate security named Sarah Vane. Vane was a creature of the shadows, someone who thrived on secrets. She didn't care about the legalities of the deed, she cared about the loyalty of her employees. She spent the next 36 hours locked in a server room, tracking login credentials and security camera footage. She found what she was looking for in the most unlikely place, the internal chat logs of the Digital Archives Department. Elias, the clerk who had shredded the deed, had been messaging a mysterious external account for weeks. The messages were encrypted, but the metadata showed a pattern. Elias hadn't shredded the deed because of a clerical error. He had been coached. Every step he took, every decision he made regarding the archives, had been guided by someone who knew exactly how to trigger the reversionary interest clause. Elias was brought into the interrogation room at 2 a.m. He looked small, terrified, and completely broken. He confessed immediately. He hadn't been bribed with money, he had been blackmailed. The entity pulling the strings had proof of a minor indiscretion from Elias's past, a gambling debt that could have ended his career before it began. He was a pawn in a much larger game. But as Vane probed deeper, she realized the identity of the person on the other end of the chat. It wasn't the heirs. It was a competing financial firm, a rival bank that had been coveting the West End property for years. They hadn't wanted the land for themselves, they had wanted to watch Thorne's empire implode. They had orchestrated the perfect, subtle destruction, turning the bank's own greed against it. Vane stared at the screen, the reality of the situation dawning on her. The competitor hadn't just destroyed the project, they had paved the way for a hostile takeover. With the bank's reputation in tatters and its leadership under investigation, the board of directors was about to be ousted. But who were the people in the shadows, and how deep did their influence go? And what would happen when Thorne realized he had been played not by a random legal loophole, but by his oldest rival? Think about the layers of deception here. Everyone sees a simple accident, but underneath, there's an entire world of corporate espionage. Does this surprise you, or is this just how business works in 2026? Let me know in the comments, do you think the big guys are always playing games like this? He had been coached. Every step he took, every decision he made regarding the archives, had been guided by someone who knew exactly how to trigger the reversionary interest clause. Elias was brought into the interrogation room at 2 a.m. He looked small, terrified, and completely broken. He confessed immediately. He hadn't been bribed with money, he had been blackmailed. The entity pulling the strings had proof of a minor indiscretion from Elias's past, a gambling debt that could have ended his career before it began. He was a pawn in a much larger game. But as Vane probed deeper, she realized the identity of the person on the other end of the chat. It wasn't the heirs. It was a competing financial firm, a rival bank that had been coveting the West End property for years. They hadn't wanted the land for themselves, they had wanted to watch Thorne's empire implode. They had orchestrated the perfect, subtle destruction, turning the bank's own greed against it. Vane stared at the screen, the reality of the situation dawning on her. The competitor hadn't just destroyed the project, they had paved the way for a hostile takeover. With the bank's reputation in tatters and its leadership under investigation, the board of directors was about to be ousted. But who were the people in the shadows, and how deep did their influence go? And what would happen when Thorne realized he had been played not by a random legal loophole, but by his oldest rival? Think about the layers of deception here. Everyone sees a simple accident, but underneath, there's an entire world of corporate espionage. Does this surprise you, or is this just how business works in 2026? Let me know in the comments, do you think the big guys are always playing games like this? The board meeting was scheduled for Friday, the 5th day after the shredding. Outside the bank's headquarters, the media had descended like vultures. The story of the shredded deed had gone viral, transforming a dry zoning dispute into a national spectacle. The phrase, "the bank that shredded its future," was trending on every social media platform. Inside, the boardroom was a pressure cooker. Thorne sat at the head of the table, his composure finally beginning to fracture. He had hoped to use the meeting to announce a legal workaround, a way to settle with the heirs and save the project. He didn't know that Sarah Vane was walking through the double doors with a thick, leather-bound folder that would serve as his execution warrant. Vane didn't speak a word as she entered. She simply slid the folder across the mahogany table to the chairman of the board. It contained the transcripts of the chat logs, the evidence of the blackmail, and the proof of the rival bank's involvement. As the chairman read, his face drained of color. He looked up at Thorne, his eyes filled with a mixture of betrayal and cold, corporate calculation. The bank's reputation was already damaged, but the admission that a rival had orchestrated their downfall from the inside would be the final nail in the coffin. Thorne attempted to justify his actions, stammering about competitive pressure and the necessity of growth, but the room had already turned against him. The board realized that the only way to save the bank from a total takeover was to purge the leadership responsible for the blunder. They didn't just want Thorne gone, they wanted him erased from the bank's history. By mid-afternoon, the announcement was made. Marcus Thorne was stepping down, effective immediately, citing personal health reasons. In reality, he had been escorted out the back entrance by security while the press waited at the front. The $52 million expansion project was officially cancelled, and the site was returned to the city's stewardship. The heirs, having achieved their victory, quietly dropped their litigation, leaving behind a neighborhood that would remain as it was, a testament to the fact that some things are meant to stay buried. The rival bank, however, began its move. They didn't buy the land, they bought the bank's distressed debt, effectively owning the very institution that had tried to destroy them. The board thought they had solved the problem by firing Thorne, but the damage was irreversible. The rival bank held the strings, and the shareholders were in full-blown revolt. As the sun set over the city, the lights of the bank's headquarters flickered, not in celebration, but in surrender. But there is one final, lingering question: what happened to the shredded remnants of that deed? And could the original heirs actually have been behind the rival bank all along? If you were on the board of directors, would you have protected Thorne, or would you have thrown him to the wolves to save your own position? This is a classic dilemma of corporate loyalty. Drop a comment: are you team loyalty at all costs, or business is just business? The final chapter of the First National Prosperity Bank's collapse didn't end in a courtroom, but in a quiet, anonymous office on the edge of the financial district. With Marcus Thorne gone and the expansion project reduced to a pile of rubble and broken promises, the public turned away. People moved on to the next scandal, the next viral sensation, and the next corporate failure. But for those who understood the mechanics of the market, the real story was only just beginning. The rival bank, which had orchestrated the downfall, didn't stop at just buying the debt. They began a systematic deconstruction of everything Thorne had built. It wasn't long before investigators discovered that the rival bank wasn't a separate entity at all. It was a holding company, a shell controlled by an opaque investment trust that traced back to the very same estate that had claimed the land. The heirs weren't just farmers or descendants of a forgotten era, they were sophisticated institutional players who had been waiting for the exact moment when the bank's overleverage became its undoing. They had used the deed of antiquity as a tactical weapon, a perfect bait that they knew the arrogant, growth-obsessed leadership of the First National Prosperity Bank could not resist. They knew that Thorne's ego would lead him to ignore the due diligence required for such an old property. They knew the clerk would be under pressure, and they knew exactly how that pressure would lead to the destruction of the evidence. It was a masterclass in psychological and legal warfare. The bank wasn't just defeated, it was outmaneuvered in every single dimension of the game. The $52 million expansion project was never actually about the building. It was about exposing the fragility of the bank's internal controls. Once the market saw that the bank could be taken down by a single piece of shredded paper, the confidence in the bank's assets evaporated. The stock price didn't just slide, it crashed. And as the bank struggled to maintain liquidity, the investment trust stepped in, buying up the discounted shares until they controlled the board, the assets, and the future of the institution. In the end, the land remained in the hands of the community, just as the original deed had intended centuries ago. The irony was absolute. The bank tried to commodify history for profit, and in the process, they were forced by history itself to become its guardian. Thorne faded into obscurity, a cautionary tale for every executive who believes that the rules of the past don't apply to the ambitions of the future. The bank is now a shadow of its former self, operating under new management, a hollowed-out monument to a war that was lost before it even truly began. The story of the shredded deed serves as a reminder that in every system, whether it's a construction project or the global financial markets, there are underlying foundations that cannot be ignored. When you lose sight of the history, the paperwork, and the reality of what you own, you are essentially building on sand. The question remains: how many other bank-owned projects are built on similar, precarious foundations? Could the next market correction be sparked by a similar, overlooked detail? The truth is rarely found in the spreadsheets, it's always hidden in the fine print. This story proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't money or influence, it's simply knowing the rules better than your opponent. If you enjoyed this deep dive, share this video with someone who thinks they know how the big players operate. And before you go, tell me, what is the most interesting legal loophole story you've ever heard? If you want to keep seeing deep dive investigations into the hidden mechanics of the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell. We're releasing a full analysis on the paper-to-physical, silver ratios next week, a topic that ties directly into how these massive institutions handle their own reserves. You won't want to miss that one. Thanks for watching.